Hi, welcome. It's Stephanie. This is the B2 course and this is lesson 13. Okay, so in this lesson, it's called Narrative Tenses 2. Remember, lesson 11, we had Narrative Tenses 1. Now, if you study that lesson, you'll remember that we looked at a tense review. So we talked about past tenses, present tenses, and some conditional tenses as well. And in this lesson, we're taking things one step further and we're going to have a look at the following topics. So in lesson 13, you will practice using time expressions, focus on key differences between during, while, and for, and learn some language for telling anecdotes. So there's lots to do in this lesson, and as I said before, it sits very nicely with lesson 11. So if you haven't had a look at lesson 11 yet, maybe after this one, go back and have a look because they do fit together very nicely. Okay, so let's start with lesson 13. Okay, we're going to begin today with some time expressions. What do I mean by time expressions? Do you have any idea? What could I mean by an expression of time? I gave you a clue just a moment ago. I gave you 3 words that are commonly confused, but can you think of any other time expressions? Okay, let's have a look together. So we have after, while, as, then, just then, before, as soon as, during, by the time, and when. And these are the key words that we are going to be practicing in the first part of this lesson. Okay, so let's begin with a question. What's the difference between during, while, and for? I want you to think about this. So I'm going to show you 3 sentences. Each one uses one of these words. Have a look and see if you can understand what is the difference. Okay, I fell asleep during the film. I fell asleep while I was studying. I fell asleep for 3 hours. So very similar, but think about how the sentences are structured. What do you notice? So pause the slide and make a note. What do you think the difference is between during, while, and for? Okay, well, let's have a look together. So during is a preposition which is used before a noun to say when something happens. But it does not tell us how long. So we're not interested in how long, it's simply when something happens. I've given you an example here. It is very cold during the winter. So here the winter is the noun and during comes before, during the winter. If you remember in our example, I fell asleep during the film. And there, the film is your noun. So during tells us when something happens. While. Well, while is used to talk about 2 things that are happening at the same time. And again, the length of time is not important here. Remember, when you use while, you need a subject and a verb. The phone rang while I was cooking. So here you have a subject and a verb, and you're using while to talk about 2 things happening at the same time. So I was cooking and the phone rang. Remember in the example, the first example, I fell asleep while I was studying. So while I was studying, I fell asleep. Two things happening at the same time. And the last one is for. So for is a preposition which is used with a period of time to say how long something goes on. So this one is connected to the length. I have lived here for 3 years. So whereas the other two are not connected with how long, or they don't tell us, for does. And remember, the first example was I fell asleep for 3 hours. So when we use for, we're interested in the length of time. Okay, hopefully that is a bit clearer, but as always, we're going to practice. So I have 6 sentences for you. I will show you the slide. I will read the sentences so you can hear the pronunciation, which is always important. And please pause the slide and see if you can note down your 6 answers. Number 1. The presentation has been going on 4 hours. Number 2. I have worked in marketing 10 years. Number 3. Can you look after my dog? I go to work. Number 4. In England, the temperature is usually around 25 degrees, the summer. Number 5. Someone was talking very loudly, the film. And number 6. It started to rain, I was waiting for the bus. So pause the video and write down your answers. Okay, how do you think you did? So remember, when we're looking at these, we're thinking about the grammar of the sentence. We're thinking about what follows. That will give you a clue if it's a noun or is it a subject and a verb. Number 1, the presentation has been going on for 4 hours. This is concerned with length of time, so we must use for. Number 2, I have worked in marketing for 10 years. Again, connected to length of time, we use for. Number 3, can you look after my dog while I go to work? So here, remember, you have the subject and the verb, so we can use while. Two things at the same time, somebody working and looking after the dog. So 2 actions at the same time, while. Number 4. In England, the temperature is usually around 25 degrees during the summer. Summer is our noun, so we're going to use during. Number 5. Someone was talking very loudly during the film. Again, the film is our noun, is telling us when something happened, so we need during. Number 6. It started to rain while I was waiting for the bus. Again, 2 actions happening at the same time, and another clue, you have a subject and a verb, so use while. How did you do? Really well done if you managed to get all of those correct. Hopefully that concept is clearer now. Okay, so we're going to move on and have a look at some of the other expressions on the list. And what I've done is I've given you 5 sentences and there are 2 choices in each sentence. All you need to do is to pause the slide and tell me which one is correct. So you need to read the sentence and think about the logic. Think about the story in the sentence. Logically, which word makes sense? Number 1. After or as waiting for 30 minutes, I decided to give up and go home. Number 2. When or before giving his presentation, the sales director checked his slides again. Number 3. While or during driving to work, I noticed a strange sound coming from the engine. Number 4. Then, or as soon as the traffic lights turned green, the car raced away. And number 5, as or during he was leaving, the phone rang. So pause the slide, please, and see if you can tell me which one do you think makes sense. How did you find that? Okay, so these words are all really useful when you are telling a story, when you have a narrative. And remember, this is the topic of the lesson. We're talking about narrative tenses, putting things in order, sequencing events. So let's check through the answers together. So number 1, after waiting for 30 minutes, I decided to give up and go home. Number 2, before giving his presentation, the sales director checked his slides again. Number 3, while driving to work, I noticed a strange sound coming from the engine. Number 4, as soon as the traffic lights turned green, the car raced away. And number 5, as he was leaving, the phone rang. Okay, how did you do with those? Good. Let's try some more examples then. Number 1, when or during the night an alarm went off and wouldn't stop. Number 2, the car broke down, then or during it started snowing. Number 3, just then or by the time the police arrived, it was too late. Number 4, as or just then there was a knock on the door. Number 5, when or before I got to work, no one was there. So again, pause the slide and see if you can tell me which one logically makes sense here. Okay, and it's time to check our answers together. So number 1, during the night, an alarm went off and wouldn't stop. Number 2, the car broke down, then it started snowing. Number 3, by the time the police arrived, it was too late. Number 4, just then there was a knock on the door. Remember, just then means at that moment. And number 5, when I got to work, no one was there. So how did you do with those? Well done if you managed to get those correct. Okay, if you're still not sure, it's a good idea to have a look in a dictionary, maybe an online dictionary or a paper dictionary, and have a look at some more examples. But what we're going to do now is to move on. And what I want us to do is to think about using these expressions in a context for you. So as I've mentioned before in previous lessons, personalising the language is a really useful and effective way of remembering and retaining the language. So it's always a good idea to try to take a new structure or take a new word and to use it in a situation relevant for you. So I've given you 5 very normal starts to a sentence, and all I want you to do is to pause the slide and see if you can complete the sentence with something that might be true for you. So number 1, as soon as, so at that moment, as soon as my alarm rang, I. Number 2, while I was eating breakfast. Remember, while is when 2 things happening at the same time. So what else might you be doing? Number 3, after I left my house this morning. Number 4, before arriving at work. And number 5, as I was driving, I noticed. So pause the slide and see if you can complete these sentences with something that might be true for you. Okay, so to give you an idea, I've completed the sentences with something that might be true for me. So number 1, as soon as my alarm rang, I got out of bed. So at that moment, when the alarm goes off, I got out of bed. So that's when we use as soon as. Number 2, while I was eating breakfast, I thought about the day ahead. So again, 2 actions at the same time. I'm eating my breakfast and I'm thinking about my day. Number 3, after I left my house this morning, I got stuck in a terrible traffic jam. So again, after and before are very useful for sequencing events. So first I left my house, next I got stuck in the terrible traffic jam. Number 4, before arriving at work, I really wanted to get a coffee. And number 5, as I was driving, I noticed the petrol was very low. So they're just some examples of things that could be true for me, and hopefully you've got some good examples of your own there. Okay, let's try another 5. So the same idea here. I'll read the sentences and then I want you to pause this slide and to try and complete the sentences with something that's true for you. Number 1, when I got to my desk. Number 2, during the presentation. Number 3, just then I heard a noise. Number 4, then. And number 5, by the time my boss arrived. So pause the slide. Can you complete these sentences? Okay, so this time I've tried to make it a bit more of a funny story. Remember, when we're telling an anecdote, when we're sharing a story, it could be something funny that's happened or something embarrassing that's happened or a mistake that you have made. So number 1, when I got to my desk, I couldn't find my presentation notes. Number 2, during the presentation, I couldn't concentrate well. Number 3, just then I heard a noise. I looked around the room. Number 4, then I realised it was my phone. I had forgotten to put it on silent. And number 5, by the time my boss arrived, everyone was talking about my terrible presentation. So again, it could be a humorous story, something funny or embarrassing or a mistake that you've made, but this language is very useful for putting things in order. Okay, how are we doing? Hopefully you're enjoying the lesson so far. Let's move on to the final stage, which is putting all of this together. So in these 2 lessons, we have been thinking about narrative storytelling, which is something that's a very useful social skill. When you're meeting people for the first time, you might want to share a story. When you're catching up with friends and colleagues, again, you might want to share something that's happened to you recently or something that you've read about in the newspaper or heard about on the radio. So we're going to have a look at some useful language now for telling an anecdote. So the word anecdote means a short story that's funny or sad or humorous, but it's a very short story that you use to build relationships with people. So we're going to have a look at some useful language. So the first slide, setting the scene, so beginning your story. And I've put some language here that I think is a useful way to start. Did I tell you about the time? a funny thing happened the other day. You will never guess what happened to me last week. I saw a really interesting story this morning. Guess what I heard? So all really useful phrases to start off and to hopefully get the person you're talking with interested in what you're going to say. Okay, then we can think about some language for sequencing as we have done. I've given you some more ideas here. Firstly, secondly, next, after that, then, by the time, during, as soon as, and in the end or finally. So, of course, when you're telling a story, to make it clear to the other person, you need to put the events in the correct order. We looked at ways of doing that with tenses in lesson 11, and today we focused on language for doing this. Okay, and it's obviously really important to try and involve the person you're speaking with. Can you believe it? Imagine how I felt when. So you see that. Does that surprise you? So just some ideas there of useful language that you can use to try to involve the person that you're talking to. Okay, so next we need to practice, and you need to think of something that you could tell as an anecdote. I've given you some ideas here. So you could think of a funny situation that happened to you, or maybe an embarrassing situation. For example, in my example, when I was giving a presentation and I forgot that my phone was left on, there was a noise, everybody's looking, it's my phone ringing in my bag. So an embarrassing or maybe funny situation. Or you could choose a mistake that you made. Or what about a coincidence? So do we know what coincidence means? A coincidence is a strange situation when two events happen at the same time. So a coincidence is always a good idea for an anecdote. Or maybe you could think of a time when you forgot something, maybe something very important. Maybe you arrived at the airport and you forgot your passport. So these are just some ideas. You could think of something else, but this is just to give you an idea of the type of situation you could choose. And what I'd like you to do is to try to use the language from this lesson to see if you can make some notes about an anecdote that you could tell. So as we said before, it's a really nice social skill. You're meeting people for the first time, you're catching up with friends. It's also useful if you're studying for an exam, such as IELTS. It's useful practice. You can use it in business situations, but be careful of your topic. Or just if you're socializing in a restaurant, building relationships. Okay, thank you very much for joining me for lesson 13. Lesson 14, the next one in our sequence, is going to be a vocabulary lesson. And this time we are looking at describing a trip. So we're thinking about adjectives to talk about how was your trip? What can you say? So we'll be focusing on ED and ING adjectives, lots of vocabulary, and as always, lots of opportunity to practice. So please join me in lesson 14. Thank you.